Hello everyone. Thanks for joining in. So myself Sridharan, Senior Systems Engineer at Decos, will be giving you an overview about how to identify, prioritize and control use related risk with regard to medical devices. So it can either be with regard to new product development as well, or it can be with regard to legacy device evaluations as well, which means like the devices that are already in market and in use. So this is the agenda that we'll be looking forward in the next 35 to 40 minutes. I'll be giving you an overview of what exactly use error is and what are the possible ways where we can identify use related hazards with regard to medical device and how we can estimate and prioritize the risks with regard to use related hazards and what are the various methods in which we can test these usability methods on a medical device, post which we can also go across the risk control measures, various risk control measures for the identified users, and how those can be documented so that it could be helpful in the regulatory perspective and putting the device in market for sales. Post even which the product is put into sales, the entire life cycle of the device is not closed there. So we need to identify users even if the device is put into market till the device is discarded. So we also need to consider monitoring, identification and control of these users once these devices are put into market for real time use. So before I enter into what exactly user error is, I'll put the difference between what is user error and what is user error. So take for an example, you are using a mobile and you are trying to switch it off. So while turning it off, you will be getting two options. One is you can either switch it off or you can restart the device. So instead of turning off the device, say suppose you are restarting. So the possibility is the device is getting restarted and the entire functionality of the device is getting rebooted again. So just instead of a medical device, instead of a mobile phone, take a medical device in its place. Say if you're going to turn off the device and instead of turning on, if you are going to restart the device, so the entire functionality of the device is going to get restarted. And the person or the user or the patient who is going to fall inside the loop of the medical device is also impacted. So the impact of use error can be multiple. So it can either be catastrophic or it can be some minimal impact on the user. So if this action is done on a medical device, we'll be terming it to be as a user error and we'll not put the deliberate action on the user. So a user error is defined as an error that is made by the user, but with regard to user error, which is completely with regard to medical device, the entire flaw is not put on the user. Instead, we'll be terming it to be as user error. So when we consider globally, the death that is caused due to medical error is quite high, starting with heart disease, that is going to be the primary source, cancer, and then medical device error stands third among these. So it is primarily very important to consider these use errors at the very early stage of device development so that we can bring down these use errors as low as possible so that the impact on the end user is going to be very minimal. So we'll start with what exactly use error is. So use error is nothing but an undesirable event that is going to take place whenever we are using a medical device. So whenever we are using a medical device, obviously we are going to have an interaction with the device, right? So devices can either be a hardware device or it can be software and a hardware together, or it can be software device as a standalone. So obviously it is going to put forth some sort of measurements. There are going to be some sort of readouts, or say suppose it is going to be needle, it is going to involve some amount of measurements as well. So whenever I'm going to perform an action incorrectly, there is always a possibility of an undesirable action that can take place, which means the interface between the human and the device is not going to be done properly. So that is going to be the source of user error. So what needs to be done? We need to investigate the source this user error is going to occur. So if there is an error that is going to take place, I need to identify the root cause for this particular error, why this particular error is happening, what is going to be the end result if this user error is going to occur. So I need to take these into consideration, and whenever I'm going to design a medical device, I need to consider this at a very early stage in the device development itself, so that I can identify these user error at a very early stage and I can put mitigation plan in the device design itself, so that the end prototype or the end device that is going to get into market is not going to involve these user errors in a real time use. So use error can primarily be classified into four categories. One is perception, cognition, action. So perception here is going to involve some set of stimuli. Say if a device is going to generate an alarm, so if that alarm is going to indicate that I need to turn the device off once this alarm goes on, and the user fails to observe this particular alarm. If the alarm is not audible enough to the user fails to observe that particular sound, which means the user is failing to observe that particular stimuli. So it is obviously going to be some sensory failure. So it can either be an alarm, or it can be some sense of vision, or it could be with regard to touch, or it could be taste as well. So we'll be calling those to be as perception error. And the next is cognition. Cognition is, say, suppose if I'm going to perform one particular action, and the task that is going to be involved, I am skipping a particular task. The reason behind this, I could have forgot that particular task. So my cognitive action is not working on properly, so that I can enable a certain process that is going to be involved while I'm using a particular device. I'll be calling that to be as a cognition error. So instead of opening a clamp, I'm going to close the clamp, and there is going to be a drug or a blood flow across that particular line. So if I'm skipping to open that particular clamp, and if it is going to involve some dialysis action, the blood is not going to go into the device, right? So I'll be calling that to be as a cognition error. And the last is going to be action error. So action error is whenever I'm going to perform a particular action and I deliberately fail to perform that, I'll be calling that to be as an action error. So say suppose if I'm going to forcefully connect to tubes, and if I'm not having the strength to perform this particular action, I'll be calling that to be as an action error. So these are the three sets of action where we'll be calling it to be as perception, cognition, action. The second possibility is slips, lapses, and mistakes. So slips is the user action does not match the original intent. Say if I need to load a 30 ml drug onto a syringe, and instead of loading a 30 ml, I'm loading 60 ml drug. So obviously, it is going to be an overdose of drug that is going to get injected. Or say, suppose if the device can carry only 30 ml drug and I'm loading 60 ml drug, I'm going to waste the drug. So I'll be calling that to be as slip. Lapse is I'm going to forget to perform a particular action. So as I said earlier, if the person is going to go across a dialysis, and if the dialysis clamp is not going to be open, even if the device is turned on and the entire action is set to perform, obviously there is not going to be a flow of drug or flow of blood into the machine and out from the machine. So I'll be calling that to be as a lapse. The third is called as mistake, where I'm going to deliberately perform an action incorrectly. So just observe this particular diagram. So this is going to be an IV line. So in this IV line, say suppose I'm going to intentionally connect an oxygen input. So it could be critical and it can be catastrophic and cause death to the patient. So this I'll be calling it to be as a mistake. And the next set is errors of commission or omission. So errors of commission is I'm going to perform an action incorrectly. So that can either be due to some mismatch, or I'm deliberately performing that particular action incorrectly. So I'll be calling that to be as errors of commission. Errors of omission is, say, once the alarm goes on, I need to turn off the device or turn on the device, and I am not acting on that particular instant. I'll be calling that to be as error of omission. So the fourth possibility is safety related. So safety related and non-safety related are the two possibilities here. And this is going to depend upon what sort of risk is going to get generated. So with regard to safety related, the risk that is going to be as an end parameter is going to be severe. But whereas with regard to non-safety related, the risk is going to be very minimal, where a clinician intervention or it is going to be some sort of disturbance, but the risk that is going to be caused is not going to be very severe. So these are the four categories where the possible occurrence of use error can fall. So we'll go across how the entire flow would work. So first, with regard to any medical device, first we need to identify what are the use related hazards. Once we have identified, like these are the set of hazards that are related with regard to this particular medical device, post which I need to estimate and prioritize these identified use errors. So estimate in the sense, few errors can be having a very less impact and few errors can have a very high impact. So I need to rank these use related risks depending upon what is going to be the impact, and I need to prioritize so that this priority could give me input on how critical, how many number of critical use errors can occur when I'm using these devices, and these critical errors should be given utmost importance so that I can minimize these critical errors from occurrence in real time. So once we identify those, we need to put forth mitigation plan. So I need to identify what solution can bring down these identified use errors. So once I identify these solutions, I need to validate those identified solutions. So all solutions can't be completely true, right? So if I'm putting a solution for one particular user error that has been identified, I need to verify it whether that particular uh, risk control measure that I have taken is proving me a better result for the identified user. So I need to identify whether the risk that has got generated is acceptable enough or not. Or say, suppose for the identified solution, there are new risks that have been identified. So I need to go back again and put forth multiple implementation of risk control measures and then go forward again. So if the risk is acceptable, I can directly document it. Or say, suppose if there are new risks that are getting generated from the identified solution, I need to go back again to the risk control measure, and this process needs to go down again. So once these risks are acceptable, I need to document it. Once this documentation is good enough, so that all the mitigation plans that have been identified are supporting the user error that are getting identified, I need to support these documents along with the device, so that once the device is put into market, these ailments can help me to minimize the user error from occurring. Or there is always a possibility for new user errors to occur when the device is put into real time, and then this entire flow would go across again. So this is how the entire process would work. So there is a quick poll question. So based on the user error definition that I had given now, you just, based on your understandability, give your answer. Thanks for your response. So most of the responses that I have got are correct. So whenever we are using a diabetic monitoring device, it always carries in a strip where the blood needs to be loaded. So if I'm going to load the strip into the device in an upside down manner, there is a possible contamination of the device. So the blood might go into the device and the further readout would be incorrect. So I need to properly load the strip onto the device so that the diabetic value that is getting displayed on the device is going to be proper. So this is going to be a user error. So now we'll go into the possibilities of identifying use related hazards. So we have multiple ways on where we can identify use related hazards. So it should start at a very early stage during the device development. So we have three different methods. One is analysis of predecessor and similar devices, and then dividing the tasks that are related with regard to the usage into multiple subtasks, and then also assuming the task load. So we'll start with the first. So whenever we are going to identify use related hazards, we need to monitor it at a very early stage of the device development itself. Once we are creating a prototype, at a later stage when we identified any use errors, we can't go back again to the design phase, alter the design and start the entire process again. So we need to start to identify all the use errors at a very early stage. So for this, we can perform various interviews with regard to the clinicians or the real-time users who are going to work on the device. It can either be a layperson or it can be a clinician, or it can be some support staff who are going to work along with the clinicians while performing this action. So we need to perform contextual interviews with the users, or perform some formative and summative observational studies to observe how the device is working, and in what scenarios and in what environmental condition the device fails to perform its intended use. Everything would be taken into consideration. So the first process of identifying the user error will be analysis of predecessors and similar devices. Say suppose I'm going to create a device, a gen 3 device, and already gen 1 and generation 1 and generation 2 devices are already in market. So I'll be having some idea on how these earlier generations of devices are performing in market, right? So I'm going to create an updated version of the device. So I'll be taking into consideration the earlier versions, how it is performing, what are the user that are associated with the device working on the earlier versions, and I'll be getting information on what are the difficulties the device is creating whenever the device is put into use. So this will be one major input that would be taken into consideration during the device design. Apart from these, I'll also take into consideration the competitive devices that are available in market. Say if I'm a manufacturer A and manufacturer B also has some sort of a similar device in market to perform the same activity, I'll be taking into consideration those information as well, so that I can observe what sort of user error the competitive devices are performing, and those errors will be taken into consideration and those will be minimized, and my design will be in such a way that those errors won't recur or won't occur during the device use. So this will put an upper hand on my device marketability as well, so that my device is going to perform intended, and the possible use error that can occur in a competitive devices don't occur on my device design. So that is one. And the next is analysis of device use tasks. So whenever I'm going to work on a device, starting from unpacking the device from its packaging till the device is going to get discarded, there is going to be a series of action that is going to get involved. So just for an example, take a syringe. So once we are opening the syringe from its packaging, there is a certain peel corner where we need to cut open the device, and post which we need to open the enclosure that is going to save the sterile part of the syringe, and we'll be attaching the needle, and then we'll be loading the drug. Once it is injected, we'll be discarding it in proper safe limits. So there are going to be multiple n number of tasks that are going to be involved when we are using a device. So I'll be putting multiple tasks that are going to be involved while using a device, and every single task would be dealt down separately, and what could be the possible risk that can take place for every single user task would be identified. So if one particular use task is going to fail, what is going to be the resultant risk, and what is going to be the hazard for this particular risk would be completely bifurcated. So that is going to be analysis of device use task. And this input would be taken as a primary source of input during the device user interface design. So whenever I'm going to come across a particular measurement device, say just for an example, take a patient monitoring system. So patient monitoring system is going to be used in multiple environmental conditions, right? So it can either be a CCU, or it can be a home care environment as well. So the environmental light would have an impact on the readout. So the readout should be bright enough, or it should be able to sense its brightness depending upon the ambient light. So my user interface should be capable enough to get adjusted depending upon the ambient light condition. So I'll be calling that to be as a best practice for user interface design. So this would help me to minimize the occurrence of user errors. The last thing is I need to consider the workload of the user as well. So if a person is going to spend some 8 to 9 hours working in a clinical environment, and if the person comes across a particular test that is going to be performed on a user, on a patient, at the 6th or the 7th hour, and say it is going to involve a large amount of tasks, say if it is going to involve 15 to 20 tasks, the mental capability of the user who is going to work on the device will have an impact. So if he has got a very stressful load throughout the day, he or she might perform an incorrect action whenever he is working on the device, right? So the task load, the task demand, and the time pressure within a specified time interval, I need to perform that action. Say if I'm going beyond the desired time interval, obviously the readout or the resultant can have some sort of error. So all these parameters should also be considered as an input on your design phase, so that all these could be a source of user error, and this can be minimized at the very early stage itself. And once we have identified these use error, we'll be moving into estimating and prioritizing the identified use related hazard. So we have three different methods. The first one is going to be FMEA. We'll be terming that to be as failure mode effect analysis. And the next is going to be fault tree analysis. And the last one is going to be usability testing. So usually it would be failure mode effect analysis and usability testing together, or it would be fault tree analysis and usability testing together. So be it anything, usability testing will always be performed on any medical device. So starting with FMEA, FMEA is going to be a bottom up approach. So you'll be starting from the basic task, and then you'll be moving on to the most important task. So it is going to be a bottom up approach. But whereas with respect to fault tree analysis, is going to be a top down approach. So both are going to be having is individual pros and cons, and both have a very good success rate on its individual methods. But the most widely sought is going to be FMEA method, and most of the design engineers and the human factors engineer who are evaluating the usability of any device, be it a new product or a legacy device, the most widely used method is going to be FMEA. So first we'll start with FMEA. So FMEA would primarily involve five main tasks, which starts with identifying potential failures and defects. So if there is going to be a pulse oximeter that is going to be used, so it was quite famous during the COVID times, right? So pulse oximeter is helpful in reading out the SpO2 level and pulse rate. So Whenever there is going to be a fluctuation in the SpO2 level or on the pulse rate during the COVID time, it created a very large amount of panic, right? So it is not primarily necessary that the person has been infected with COVID. It can be a possible device failure as well. So for every particular medical device that is going to be deployed in real time, it can either be a standalone device, or it can be a device that is going to work along with another device, or it can be a critical device as well. So for any device that is going to be used in a clinical environment or in a home environment as well, irrespective if it is going to be a medical device, we need to identify what are the potential failures and what could be the resultant effect that can take place if a use failure related to the functional capability of the device can occur. So if the device fails to produce a readout, there is obviously the intended task of the device is not extracted completely, right? So I need to understand what are the functional requirements, and if there is going to be a functional failure, what is going to be the end impact if this function is not going to occur. So I need to identify two things. One is I need to identify the potential failure that can take place, and post which I need to identify what can be the effect that can occur when this failure is going to occur. So post which I'll be determining the severity. So severity will always give us information on the seriousness of the identified failure. So if this failure is going to occur, what would be the severity that is going to be caused on the user, or it can be the patient as well. So we need to identify the seriousness for the functional failure that can take place. So once we have identified the severity, we'll move into identifying the occurrences. So if this failure is occurring, what could be the cause for this particular failure to occur? So we need to identify what is going to be the root cause. Post which we need to identify the detectability. So we need some detection values to indicate that this failure can likely be detected whenever I'm going to use this device in a real time. So these three parameters, severity and occurrence and detectability, will be used to derive a number called as risk priority number. So this risk priority number would be S cross O cross D, will give us a critical information on if a functional failure is going to occur, what could be the risk priority for this identified potential failure that has occurred. So this would give us some in-depth information both clinically and with regard to the functional aspect of a particular device, so that we can identify the most probable occurrence. So it can either be a mechanical failure, or it can be an electromagnetic failure, or it can be some thermal related, or it can be radiation or some biocompatibility, anything. So we need to identify all these parameters, and finally we'll be deriving this RPN number, which will give us some in-depth information on these identified potential failures. And the next is FTA, where we'll be calling it to be as a fault tree analysis. So I'll explaining this with a case study. So this image is nothing but an MR diffused weight image of a 75-year-old male who has observed some abnormality in his normal functionality. So it would start with a top-down approach, as I said earlier. FMEA is going to be a bottom-up approach. FTA is going to be a top-down approach. So with the top event, so what is going to be the main cause for this activity to perform is, the main event is going to be a 74-year-old male has observed some cognitive decline and some headaches. So we'll be branching out on what could be the possible reason for this ailment to occur. So it can either be a paraneoplastic syndrome, or it could be a disease in the blood vessel, or it could be some meningitis. And furthermore, we'll branch out to every possible outcome on every single output that we have derived here. So with regard to meningitis, it can either be lepto or meningitis. And furthermore, we will be dividing on what could be the reasons this failure could occur. Post which we will be performing test on the individual based on these 6 or 5 branches that we have derived, and which from which we'll be identifying what is the cause for the ailment to occur. So just in case, correlate this with a medical equipment. So medical equipment are manufactured at one particular point and is put into use at another point, right? So obviously it is going to involve some amount of transport. So there is always a possibility of an infection to get occurred whenever we are transporting a device from one place to another place, right? So transport infection can occur during the times of loading, whenever we are loading the device, and another possibility is during the times of unloading as well. So during loading and during unloading, there are three possible methods. So any particular medical device should be handled sterile. So if I'm going to use a medical device, I need to take into consideration I'm having some protective equipment or protective covering, and I'm having some sterile gloves, so that whenever I'm handling a medical device, I am not going to contaminate it. since it is going to involve a user, whenever this medical device is going to be put into use, there is always a possible contamination to take place if the sterile environment is compromised. So the possible infection during loading and unloading can occur if I'm not using a protective equipment, or it can be due to spilling or leakage. Say if it is going to be a pharmaceutical drug that is getting loaded, and if there is going to be a leakage or a spilling of drug on a single carton or on the entire carton or the entire packaging of the medical device, there is always a possibility like the device can get contaminated, or its intentional use is going to get deliberately divided. So, and the next possible thing is going to be contact. So if the person who is going to transport or load and unload this device, he must have certain protective covering so that he or she who is handling this device is not going to contaminate, or even the device where it is getting loaded, the truck should be very clean enough so that the device that is getting transported is not contaminated. So we'll be calling that to be as contact. So these are the three possibilities where contamination or infection can take place during times of loading and unloading. The next possible way is going to be infection during transport. So infection during transport is if the transport conditions are not maintained proper. Say for any medical device, say if it is going to be a drug, obviously we need to maintain a certain clinical environment so that the efficacy of the drug is not going to be altered in any manner. So I need to maintain some ambient temperature. If I need to transport the drug anywhere between 0 to 2 degrees Celsius, and if the temperature is going to go beyond 2, obviously the efficacy of the drug is going to get disturbed and it is not going to work as intended, right? So inadequate transport condition can cause some amount of infection. Or if the person who is going to transport it into the from the packaging into the transport environment, if they are having some sort of injury, and if it is getting contact with the carton box, it can have some impact on the drug sterility or on the product sterility. So this is how we'll be drafting FTA, where it is going to be a top down approach. So we'll be starting with the primary source, and then we'll be branching out where we'll be deriving what could be the possible ways this failure could occur. So once we have done this, we'll be going into a detailed usability study where we'll be involving some 7 to 8 parameters to evaluate the usability testing methods. So the first one is going to be appropriate test method. So if I'm creating a patient monitoring system, obviously it can go along with the patient whenever he's being transported from one environment to other, or it can be a support staff who is going to carry that particular patient monitoring system, right? So it is going to have some 5 to 6 kgs. So this 5 to 6 kg should be supportive enough so that the user who is going to handle this device does not fail, like he can handle it at ease. Say if the weight of the device is going to be enormous, the person who is going to handle it won't have a suitable aspect to handle this device at ease, right? So we'll be mimicking in a device, creating a prototype that is going to match the exact device weight, and we'll be put it into a summative formative evaluation to evaluate how this device is going to be in real time. And then we need to focus on user interactions as well. So we'll be taking into consideration the testing efforts. So here we'll be identifying the measurement parameters, and we'll be creating trivial task to just identify whether the identified critical task during the early stages are proved fruitful. So if I'm having a critical task, I'll be observing how this critical task is put forth to work, and whether the user is failing to perform this particular task, or whether is the user is performing it at ease. So everything would be focused on user interaction. And apart from the anticipated errors, we are also having a possible source of unanticipated errors. So there is always a possibility for unanticipated errors to occur, right? So here we'll be putting forth multiple testing methods and multiple analysis so that what possible unanticipated errors can occur will also be identified. And the next is going to be subjective assessment. So in subjective assessment, we'll be recruiting real-time users. So if the device is going to be used by a neural doctor, we'll be employing in a neural doctor with various levels of experience so that we can observe how the neural physician or the neural doctor, whenever he is performing a surgery, what would be the steps that would be involved while using this particular device. So this will be terming it to be a subjective assessment where we'll be deploying real-time users. And the next would be to monitor the extent of testing effort. So here testing effort, we'll be monitoring the environmental condition, and we'll be creating some drawbacks in the environment to identify how the device is failing to perform if the environmental conditions are failing. So it can be an informal activity that can take place, or it can be a formal activity that can take place, creating a hindrance on the device working. So here we'll be having multiple usability validation testing methods to identify how the device is performing. So we'll be having summative evaluation. So I'll be giving a detailed explanation on formative summative evaluation in the future slide. And then we need to recruit appropriate test participants as well. So if the device is going to be used by a lay person as well, evaluating the device in a clinical environment alone will not be sufficient enough to identify the use task, right? So if I'm a lay user, I'm going to come across that particular device, I don't have any prerequisite knowledge on how the device is going to work. So even a lay user should be recruited as a test participant, and the device should be completely evaluated on a layperson perspective as well. So that is what we'll be terming it to be as recruiting appropriate test participant to evaluate the device working. And the next is training prior to testing. So say if it is going to be a CT or an X-ray mission or an MR mission, so it is going to be a very huge device that is going to involve a very large amount of cost, and the person who is going to go across this device is also going to get emitted across a certain amount of radiation, right? So if a person who doesn't have any prerequisite knowledge is exposed to this device working, and instead of giving in a 0.5 radiation, I'm going to give in 1. So the impact of radiation can have a severe impact on the end user. So training prior to using the device is very critical, so that the person will have some prerequisite knowledge on how the device is working, and that can enable him to perform the intended actions correctly. And the required sample size, so required sample size is also very important. So if the device is going to be used by a very large amount of population, recruiting 5 or 6 to enable the to identify how the device is working won't be sufficient enough. So we need to improve our counts as well. So we will be recruiting 50 to 60 participants to identify how the device is working. Once we have done this, the usability testing methods would generally involve two evaluations. So one is formative, another one is summative evaluation. So formative evaluation will take place at a very early stage of device development. So formative evaluations would involve four tasks. One will be calling it to be as exploratory testing, which is going to involve some amount of simulated environment. So as I said earlier, if the PMS device is going to weigh 5 kg, the 5 kg device won't be given to the user as such. Instead, a mimicked environment would be created. So if it is going to be a software, the end software won't be given to the user. Instead, a mimicked environment would be created, and we'll be observe how the user comes across this particular mimicked environment. So that we'll be calling it to be as exploratory testing. And the next we'll be terming it to be as comparison or competitive testing, where we'll be gathering data from competitive devices. So here we'll be minimizing the user error that are occurring in competitive devices, taking into consideration those user errors and how these input can be minimized in our design. So we'll be extracting those data from this comparison testing. And the next is going to be comparison again, where we'll be calling it to be as contrast testing. So whenever we are evaluating a prototype, it's not going to be one design that is getting evaluated. We'll be having more than one design. So it is 3 or 4 design, multiple designs will get evaluated, and we'll be evaluating how every single design is performing. So if there are multiple number of user errors that are occurring in design 1, we'll be scrapping that and we'll be going with design 2 and design 3. So every single input that is going to be extracted from every single design will be compared, and which is going to offer us the least user error and working as intended will be considered for further development. And the last is going to be assessment testing, where the entire prototype will be evaluated on a real time. So as I said earlier, exploratory, it is going to be a mimicked environment, but with regard to assessment testing, it is going to be a real time device with a real time environment that is going to be tested on a user. The last is going to be summative evaluation. The first informative evaluation, the users who are going to be involved are going to be in smaller numbers, say 10 to 20 will be recruited, and it's going to be a closed environment. But whereas with regard to summative evaluation, it is going to be a larger number, since medical devices can go across various demographies. So we'll be recruiting people from various demographies, considering various categories of people, like it can be adult, the device can cater to adult or pediatric or neonate. So everything would be considered and evaluations would be performed, and this would take place at a later stage of development, post which we'll be going in for risk control methodology. So the first risk control would be design modification. So if I have identified a user error at a very early stage, the first step that I can have to minimize these user error would be design modification. So I can go from A to B so that I can bring down the user error. So the next point would be safeguard. So if I'm going to use a radiating emitting equipment, how I can protect the user from the radiation getting emitted. So I need to have certain aprons, lead aprons, so that the user who is going to come across this is not getting disturbed due to the radiations. And the third thing is going to be modification of intended use. Say suppose I'm going to create a device that is going to cater an adult population, and while real time use, while performing these evaluation, if the device is going to also cater neonates and pediatric, if the intended creation is going to solve only for adult, I won't change the intended use, so I'll be including a larger population, so I'll be changing the intended use like that. My device is going to cater to adult, male, female, pediatric and neonate as well. So that is what we'll be calling it to be as modification of intended use. And the next is going to be training. So before I put forth any device into real time, I need to make sure I give proper training to the user. The last possible method where I can have a risk control is warnings and labels. So if a device is going to be used for only one time, I need to put forth proper warnings or labels in the IFUs or in the package itself, so that the device, whenever it is going to be used on a real time, the user would first come across these symbols. So we'll have some prerequisite knowledge, like say this is going to be a sterile device, so this is going to be a one time use device, so this device can't be used in an MR environment. So all these can be given through warnings and labels. So once we have identified mitigation plans, we need to evaluate the effectiveness of the risk control measure. So effectiveness would be done in through two steps. One is we need to validate the design change that has been done. So we need to identify whether there were any new risks. Post which we'll be performing the summative evaluation again to identify whether there are any new use risk that have been occurred. Post which we'll be validating the overall safety. So here we'll be including abnormal situations. As I said earlier, it can be a very bright environment, or it can be a very high humid environment, or various temperature conditions. So every possible abnormal situations would be created and the device working would be identified. And we'll also identify whether there were any occurrence of low probable use error risk events. So this will validate the overall safety of the device. So once we have identified these risk mitigation plan, we need to document this. So we'll be creating a user error risk analysis document. So this user error risk analysis document would help us moving through the regulatory requirements of every particular country. And these usability test reports would carry information about the formative and summative evaluation that has been performed on this device. And this will be a substantial evidence that these tests have been performed on the device and my device is working as intended and there are no new use risk associated with the device working. And we'll be creating kappa plans for the modifications that has been done. So kappa is nothing but we'll be terming it to be as corrective action and preventive action for the use errors that we have identified. And these are the plans that we have put forth. Whenever there is a use error that can take place, these kappa plans would help us to mitigate these identified risks. So once that is done, once the device is put into real time use, we'll be monitoring the post market activities as well. So we need to identify what are the post market errors that has been recorded. So all the user error risks that we have identified during the design phase, development phase and identification phase, that our entire process won't stop there. It would go once the device is put into market as well. So we need to identify what are the user errors that are recorded in market. We need to train the interview, or like we need to interview the personals who are involved in training the clinicians or the doctors while selling the device. So if I'm not going to impart a proper knowledge on the user, I'm failing to perform an action, and there is also always a possibility for a user error to occur, right? And then we need to track these incidents, and if there are any device returns or supplier recalls due to a particular failure, what is the reason for this particular failure? So we need to combine all these three and we need to take back those into the design phase. If there are any data related with regard to use error, we need to go back, identify whether these are existing use errors that we have already identified during the device development phase, or if it is new, how can I mitigate these, and what could be the possible solution for bringing down these risks. So we'll be going and touching those aspects as well. So this is how the entire process of identifying use related hazards would work, and it won't stop during the design development phase itself. Till the device is discarded from its real time use, this entire loop would circle. So these are the services that we offer at Decos. So we offer the entire human factors usability evaluation for all new product development and for legacy devices as well, and help in creating various FMEA documents starting from design process and functional FMEA. Everything would be considered. And these are the various services that we offer for all the medical devices, be it a new product development or legacy devices as well. So for any queries related to services, we are here. you can contact us. We have Mr. Devesh Agarwal, General Manager Services at Decos, and myself, Sridharan, Senior Systems Engineer at Decos. Thanks for your time, team. Thanks for your patient listening. And you can always contact us if you have any queries. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.